Let's give a warm Steamboat welcome to Carly Fiorina.
Well, thank you so much for that fantastic Steamboat Springs welcome. So many of you have been so gracious already this evening. I've been offered many coats as I stood outside and took photos, pashminas. So many of you have been so warm and kind in your welcome. Thank you so much. And a number of you have asked me whether I'm going to be able to enjoy Steamboat Springs, and sadly the answer is no. I'm leaving tomorrow to go back down to Denver to do a couple events for Mike Kaufman, and then I'm headed out to Pennsylvania to try and do some things for Pat Toomey. And there are a lot of great people up and down the ballot. We get so fixated on the presidential race for obvious and good reasons, but there are so many good and honorable people up and down the ballot that we need to send to Washington or return to Washington. And I know you're helping as many candidates as you can, and thank you for that. You know, one of the things I always remember when I come to Colorado, but especially way up here at, where are we, 9,000 feet or something? You know, a little alcohol goes a long way. And in fact, I was on my flight up here. Some of us were saying that, well, you know, the way this election season is going, some of us are drinking earlier and earlier in the day. Anyway, so you just never know what I might say tonight. And so the cell phones need to go away. No tweeting, no dumpster fire tweeting, please, Ben. Just no tweeting. We're just going to have a conversation about where we are. So to start that, and who we are actually, because you are, this institute is, and you as donors and patrons and colleagues of this institute, you are influential, important citizens of this nation. And as citizens of this nation, we need to know where we are, we need to remember who we are, and we need to chart our path forward. Because as important as this election is, things don't get fixed in a single election or by a single candidate, no matter who they are. How many of you are House of Cards fans? Okay, well, I have to admit, I was like glued to House of Cards for the first 2 seasons, and then I kind of made it through the 3rd season, and I wasn't as wild about that one. And then I started the 4th season. And it just seemed so out there to me. You know, it just kind of jumped the shark for me. And so I quit watching. And then I had a friend who said, no, you really need to finish season 4. So my husband Frank and I, we tend to be binge watchers of House of Cards. And so we've made it all the way through. We only have 2 episodes left. We just finished the convention, for those of you who watch it. And I had this revelation. House of Cards isn't jumping the shark at all. We're actually living through a season of House of Cards. Think about it. Who would have imagined that we have Russians hacking into DNC emails? We have meetings on the tarmac in airplanes. My husband said to me when we finished, I won't give it away for those of you who still have made the season, but let's just say that Frank and Claire Underwood are a husband and wife team. And at the end of a convention where they're both standing on the stage in triumph, my husband Frank, of 35 years, looks at me and he says, you know, it's not really very realistic that a husband and wife would be, in this case, president and vice president. I said, really? Who would have imagined that we have a president and a wife who are president and want to be president? And the thing is, I've decided not only we're living through a season of House of Cards, but actually Bill and Hillary Clinton are the model for Frank and Claire Underwood. They actually are. This is a couple that is bound together by a single-minded ambition. This is a woman who has done anything, said anything, sacrificed everything in the service of that ambition. And I am here to say to all women, but particularly young women, that is not feminism. It is not feminism to say anything, do anything, sacrifice everything, including your marriage, in the service of your ambition. In truth, Hillary Clinton has achieved this pinnacle because she's traded on her husband's name and fame and position. No, that is not feminism. And it is also not feminism to tell young women, or women of any age, that if you don't vote a certain way or you don't think a certain way, that somehow you're not for women. In the course of my presidential campaign, I was called an enemy of women. An enemy of women. Because I didn't stick to their litany of liberal causes, and most particularly, I am a proud pro-life conservative. So that made me anti-woman. That's not feminism. Feminism, my definition of it, and it's sad that it's become kind of a bad word, feminism is when every woman, any woman, as well as any man, has the opportunity to use all of her God-given gifts and has the chance to choose her path and live life on her own terms. Whether that's raising 5 kids and homeschooling them or running for president. I'm a feminist, and I'm not voting for Hillary Clinton. This is a week, or maybe the last 10 days or so, when many of us sent our children or our grandchildren off to college or back to college. Our oldest granddaughter, Kara, just returned to college. And so for any of you who are or have sent your kids or your grandkids off to college, you know that bittersweet feeling you get. You're so proud of the milestone they've achieved. You're joyful that they're happy, that they're healthy, that they're focused on the future and moving forward. And you're sad that a childhood went by way too quickly and won't come again. But as we sent Kara off to college, I thought about what it must be like to be a young person, 18 or 19 or 20, and for this to be your first presidential election. The only presidential election you've known. Think about that. What is it they must think? What is it they must think about our politics and our nation? Well, first of all, they must think that politics is kind of like, I don't know, it's a sport now. It's not really serious. It's sort of like worldwide wrestling, right? And they must think, you know, journalists actually don't care about substance. I mean, despite the protestations of most journalists, it's clear they don't care about substance. Some do, but very few. What they seem to care about is the controversy and the insults and the superficial stuff that candidates sometimes talk about. What must they think when we have, unfortunately, both candidates this week? One's calling one a bigot and the other one's calling one a racist. What must they think when they see the Attorney General of the United States refusing to indict Hillary Clinton, despite an incredible statement by the FBI director? They must honestly think, wow, no one is above the law. What a quaint notion that was. How naive to believe that the Justice Department actually isn't politically motivated. That's what you would think if you were 18 or 19 or 20 and this was your first election, you probably think that politics is pretty corrupt. And you probably think that a lot of people in politics aren't doing it for the people. They're doing it for themselves. That's what you might think if you were a young person. And this was your only and first presidential election. And what do you think when you see these emails? We now know, by the way, we now know what the private server was about. I actually believe that Hillary Clinton did not intend to compromise classified information, although she clearly did, and she clearly lied about it. But I don't think that's what she intended. I think the private server was there for a whole different reason. The private server was to hide the truth of the incredible interlocking nature of her personal and her professional life. The private server was there. The private server was there to disguise the fact that the Clinton Global Initiative is kind of a political halfway house for everyone who was waiting to go back to work for her campaign. And that it was, let's say it, a pay-to-play scheme. I know many of the donors to the Clinton Global Initiative. I can assure you that the Crown Prince of Bahrain, just as one example, didn't give all that money to the Clinton Global Initiative for any other purpose than he thought it might get him a favor with the Secretary of State or perhaps the future President of the United States. This is pay to play. That's why she had the private server, so we wouldn't see all that. And if you're a young person, 18, 19, or 20, and this is your first presidential election, what you're thinking right now maybe is, wow, it doesn't seem to matter with a whole set of voters. It certainly doesn't seem to matter with a whole bunch of journalists. That's pretty shocking. Here's what's even more shocking. If you're a young person right now and this is your first election, you might conclude that our federal government is corrupt. You might conclude that politicians, whether they're professional ones or recent ones, aren't in it for us, they're in it for themselves. And guess what? That's what 80% of the American people believe. Gallup has been asking two questions of the American people for decades. And the answers are coming back loud and clear and have been for quite a while. 80% of the American people now describe the federal government as incompetent and corrupt. And 80% of the American people also describe politicians as being in it for themselves, their privilege, their position, their power, and not to solve problems and do the people's work. Sadly, as a nation, despite all of our differences and our disagreements and our divisions, we have found common ground on this issue. It ain't working. It ain't working. And by the way, think about what 80% means. 80% means Democrats, independents, Republicans, young, old, men, women, it's everybody. The government isn't working for us anymore. It's not doing its job. And too many politicians aren't doing their job either. You know, the theme of this conference is we hold these truths to be self-evident. This cannot be the legacy that we leave our children and grandchildren. This cannot be the legacy that politics just doesn't work, that it's all corrupt, that it's all a game. This cannot be the legacy we leave. And so I think as citizens, whether we run for office or hold office, whether we support others who run for office, we are all citizens. And I think as citizens, we now must think long and hard about what our responsibilities are. I ran for president because I think there are two things that ultimately we're going to have to fix, and we're not going to fix them in one election, and a single candidate can't fix them, no matter how brilliant they are. Not even the president can fix them by themselves. Two things we must fix. Number one, we must relearn the process of self-government. We have forgotten. For way too long, we have to relearn the process of self-government and self-governance. For way too long, we have let decision-making, power, money flow out of communities and families and states and back to Washington, D.C. It's been going on for a long time. Both parties have participated in it. And here's the thing about power, and you know this, power that isn't used is lost. And so we have to regain our power as citizens of this nation. We have to regain the power in our communities, in our families, in our states. And the second thing that has to happen is we must cut these vast, unaccountable, corrupt bureaucracies down to size and hold them accountable. So I think the first step in that process as citizens, when we think about what we can do and what we must do, I think we need to remember who we are. And remember that ours was intended to be a citizen government. It is what of, by, and for the people means. We've never intended to just hand it off to some stranger thousands of miles away. Of, by, and for the people. So I want to talk a little bit about who we are as a nation. You know it. You're here tonight, so you know it. But it's worth reminding ourselves. And to remind us of who we are, I actually am going to go very far away from here. Very far away from Steamboat Springs, or even this nation. I want to take you to the slums of New Delhi. Now, it might be a strange place for me to start, but before I ran for the presidency, I was the chairman of two prominent charities in this country, and one of them is called Opportunity International. Opportunity International is the largest microlending, microfinance organization in the world. Christian-based. Microfinance is the lending of very small amounts of money, on average $100, to extremely poor people. One of the reasons that people are poor is because they have no capital. No one will take a chance on them. Opportunity International has lent $8 billion, $100 at a time. And we have lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. So I take you to the slums of New Delhi because in January of 2015, I held a global board meeting in New Delhi. And at the end of the board meeting, I decided that I wanted to visit with some of our clients. By the way, 93% of our clients are women. Women, it turns out, make very good entrepreneurs. And the data is pretty clear. If you get women more and more and more engaged in society and solving whatever problem exists, it gets solved faster, and everyone is lifted up. You can applaud. The data is clear. In any event, I traveled to the slums because that's where our clients are. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to the slums of New Delhi, but they're pretty grim. Mountains of trash, marauding animals, sewage in the streets, and people piled on top of each other. And as I looked at the desperate circumstances around me and climbed, I had to climb a rickety little ladder to get up to this roof where I was meeting with 10 of our clients. I have to tell you, I steeled myself as I climbed that ladder because I expected to see desperate people. I expected to see desperation in their eyes, the desperation that I saw all around me. But when I sat down with these women, that is not what I saw. I saw women who were poised and beautiful and wrapped in the beautiful clothing of their region. But more than that, when I looked in their eyes, I did not see desperation. I saw focus. I saw determination. I saw hope. I saw pride. Because you see, we had done more than give them $100, although that was very important. We had done more than give them tools and training and support, although that also was important. We had done more than say to them, we will give you a helping hand, although every single one of us needs a helping hand sometimes. I sure have. And we did more than say to those women, we will take a chance on you, although we had. And every one of us needs someone to take a chance on us sometimes. I sure have. No, we had done more than that. What we had said to these women was, you have value. You have potential. You have the ability to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning, and we will help you do so. I have traveled and lived and worked all over the world. I have seen people in desperate circumstances, but I also know this: every human person has the opportunity, the potential, the desire to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning, because each life is filled with potential and all of us are gifted by God. That is a certainty. And we know we actually know where dignity and purpose and meaning come from. Dignity comes from work well done. Purpose comes from family. The women I met with were so proud. One of the women said to me, you know, she lived with her husband and her in-laws. She said, my in-laws and my husband were very against this. They wouldn't let me take the loan for a long time. And I said, well, how do they feel about this now? She said, well, they all work for me. She had found purpose in lifting her family up. And we also know that meaning comes from a spiritual foundation. And when we cut people off from the dignity of work, when families fall apart so that people lose purpose, and when we undermine the spiritual foundation in people's lives, they go adrift. We know this. Now, why is it, if each of us are gifted by God and all of our lives are filled with potential, if all of us have the capacity and the desire to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning, why is it that more things have been more possible for more people here than anywhere else on earth? Why is it that only in this nation, and believe me, it is only possible in this nation, why is it that it is only in this nation that a young woman can start out the way I did, typing, filing, answering the phones for a 9-person real estate firm in the middle of a deep recession, go on one day to become the chief executive of what we turned into the largest technology company in the world, and run for the presidency of the United States? It's only possible here, and the question is why? Why is it only possible here? You see, I think it is because of those truths we hold self-evident. Our founders were students of history. They were students of philosophy. I appreciate that because I was a history and philosophy major in college. It's why I had to start in business as a secretary. There is hope after a history and philosophy degree, but what I learned studying history, I think our founders learned when they studied history and philosophy. Here's the thing you learn when you study those things. Human nature doesn't change. Times change, values change, cultures change, habits change, but human nature doesn't change. And there are two fundamentals about human nature that our founders knew and that are as true today as the day the Constitution was written. Number one, everyone has the capacity to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning. And so our founders built a nation on this incredible revelation. It was unique in the world at the time. It actually still is. It was quite radical at the time. And that revelation was, you know what? Each of us are gifted by God. And because all of us are gifted by God, all of us have rights that come from God. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our founders said, and this was what was truly radical at the time, that those rights, because they come from God, cannot be taken away by man or government. But they coupled that revelation, and it is still unique in the world. There is no other nation on earth founded on that fundamental principle. They coupled that with the other thing that they knew about human nature because they had studied history. And the other thing that's always been true is power concentrated is power abused. Power concentrated is power abused. I don't care where it's concentrated. I don't care if it's a business. I don't care if it's a boardroom, a committee room, politics, religion. It doesn't matter. Power concentrated is power abused. And what happens when power gets concentrated is the people who hold that power, not only do they abuse it, but they do whatever they can to hang on to it. It's just kind of the way it is. It's why the status quo has so much power. Because once you have it, you don't want to give it up. And so you hang on. It's why change is so hard, because you have to battle the status quo. So what did our founders do? Knowing that power concentrated is power abused, they had the Articles of the Constitution, and they said, you know what, we're going to give the federal government very specific powers, enumerated powers. And they said, if these powers are not enumerated to the federal government, we're going to make it really plain in the 9th and 10th Amendments, among other places, that the power not specifically enumerated and granted to the federal government rests with individuals and families and communities and states. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come a very long way from there. And to fix what ails us, we must return to where we came from. Not because we look backwards, not because we're afraid of change, but because human nature is human nature. And each of us are gifted by God, can live lives of dignity and purpose and meaning, and power concentrated is power abused. It is why we believe in grassroots efforts and decentralized decision-making and power in families and communities. And we must, I believe, re-educate. Part of relearning self-governance is to re-educate our nation about what the Constitution really is and why it is as relevant a document today as it was the moment it was written. It is not some dusty relic. It is a roadmap for how to solve our nation's problems. You know, one of the things that I remarked on when I ran for president is I didn't always see that look that I saw in those Indian women's eyes, in the eyes of the people that I looked into. I would be greeted all too often by veterans, strong, powerful, fighting men who would come up to me with tears in their eyes and tell me how powerless they felt to fight a bureaucracy, to figure out how to get the care that they had already earned. I remember talking to single moms who had had the courage to bring their children into the world, but who now found that every time they tried to move forward and provide a better life for themselves and their children, every program of dependence we had put around them did not help them move forward. It held them back. We have tangled people's lives up in webs of dependence that are almost impossible to escape from. If you're a single mom and you're working, you know, maybe you're earning $20,000 a year and you've got a couple kids on food stamps and you're offered a job that pays you twice as much, guess what? You're going to lose a whole lot of things that you depend upon. So if you're that single mom, what do you think? You think, this is a risk I cannot take. What if I'm laid off? What if the job goes away? What am I going to do with my kids? We don't lift people up and say, yes, we're going to take a chance on you. Yes, you have God-given gifts. You can live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning. Frankly, I think we ought to try microfinance in this country because I know it works. And that's a heck of a lot better than assigning someone to a lifetime of dependence where they cannot find the dignity they seek or lift their families up. We must speak into people's lives. The Democrats are so wrong on probably the most important issue in most families, education. They are so wrong. And we, of course, we have so many great elected officials who talk about this all the time, but as citizens, we cannot just leave it to our elected representatives. We need to be talking about it with our fellow citizens. How is it that Democrats are prepared to literally deny parents a choice, an opportunity to give their children an education? But that is what Democrats are doing all across this country, all up and down the ticket. And you can bet that President Hillary Clinton will stand behind the teachers union all day long. I remember standing and watching the TV when the head of the Chicago Public Teachers Union took to a microphone in the middle of a teacher's strike in Chicago. And she said, you know, they struck early on in Rahm Emanuel's tenure. They struck over the issue of teacher accountability, performance in the classroom. What a novel concept. And the head of the Chicago Public Teachers Union said this. She said, we cannot be held accountable for the performance of students in our classroom because too many of them are poor and come from broken families. Now, what was she saying? What she was saying was, if you're poor and you come from a broken family, you can't learn, we don't have to teach you. Don't worry, we'll take care of you. You see, this is what progressives believe. They do not believe that each of us are gifted by God or that all of us are capable of living lives of dignity and purpose and meaning. No. What progressives believe is that some are smarter than others. Some are better than others. So some get to decide for others and some will take care of others. And that is the height of disrespect and disregard for every single American. What do I mean when I say we cannot leave this just to our elected officials? Let's face it, some of us don't like to get in political discussions with people who don't agree with us. Right? You get into a cocktail party, you're a conservative, really? Then you feel like you're on the defensive and, oh gosh, I can't talk to this person. So what do so many of us do? We kind of walk away from the conversation. We can't walk away from these conversations anymore. Because here's the thing. Whether people are listening or look like they're listening or not, each of us is most influenced by people we know. You have enormous influence. And sometimes you need to use it. We all need to use it with people who don't agree with us. Because it's kind of like our kids, you know? They don't act like they're listening, but actually they hear more than we think. I went on The View. Actually, it was quite fun. And the reason I went on The View, it's not exactly where a campaign manager would tell you to go, but I went on The View because if we're going to win hearts and minds, we have to go and speak to people who don't yet know they agree with us, right? So I went on The View, and I'm having a conversation with the ladies of The View. And we're having quite a good time, and one of their hosts, a lovely woman named Rosie Perez, we're chatting about Vladimir Putin. And what's he like? Because, you know, I've had meetings with him, and all of a sudden she stops and she says, you know, Carly, I like you. She was shocked, clearly. I'm not a Republican, she said. I said, wow, Rosie, I'm shocked to learn this. And then she said, why are you? Why are you a conservative? That is the question that as citizens of this great nation, we have to boldly stand up and answer day after day after day. So here's what I said. I said, Rosie, I'm a conservative because I know that no one of us is any better than any of the rest of us. Each of us are gifted by God. I'm a conservative because I know our policies, our principles, and our values work better to lift people up. Unlike a progressive, I don't think some are better than others. And I don't think some should decide for others. So I'm a conservative because I believe each of us are gifted by God and all of us can live lives of dignity, purpose, and meaning. We have to have that argument day after day after day. It's important that we support candidates. It's important that we give them checks, but we have to engage as citizens because ours was intended to be a citizen government, of, by, and for the people. And that means as citizens, if we want to leave a different legacy to our children and grandchildren, then we have to do what you all do. We have to engage day after day. I talk to a lot of young people. And of course, most young people, not all, but most young people just sort of think they're liberal. And you know, they have various reasons for thinking they're liberal. Maybe it's the social issues. I want to tell you 2 stories about young people, just as an example. I was at a diner, and a young woman came up to me. I know she was 17 because I asked her. Very bright, very self-confident. And she walked up to me and she said, "Why do you hate LGBT people?" I said, "Wow, why do you think that?" She said, "Well, I read it." "Where'd you read it?" "On the internet." I said, "Well, do you believe everything you read?" "No, I don't, but this made sense to me." I said, "Really, why did it make sense to you?" She said, "Well, you're pro-life." See, this is sort of the training, but you have to agree with them on every litany, otherwise you're a hater. And I said, "Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever known a pregnant woman?" She said, "Oh yeah, my aunt's pregnant." I said, "Well, have you observed that? Have you watched her belly grow? Have you patted her stomach? You've maybe felt the baby kick?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Are you so convinced that's not a life?" "Because I'm pretty convinced it is." Now, why does that make me hate LGBT people? Even on really tough issues like abortion, the truth is this country has found common ground. The vast majority of women, the vast majority of young people, the vast majority of Americans believe that abortion for any reason at all after 5 months is wrong. Let's go take that common ground. Let's go get that done. It's also true that the vast majority of Americans have no idea what Democrats think. They have no idea what their policy positions are. So you know how it goes. Republicans are, you know, I've been challenged, Katie Couric, you name it. Why are you pro-life? And I'll answer. I think science proves us right every day. I've had personal experiences with friends who've gone to Planned Parenthood. I tell all that story. But what always stops them cold is when I say, do you know what the Democrat policy position is? It's not a life until it leaves the hospital. That's their position. That's their policy. Any abortion, anytime, for any reason. Do you think it's okay that a 13-year-old girl can get an abortion without her mother's permission, but needs a permission slip to go to a tanning salon? Does that strike you as right? Does it strike you as right that a tattoo parlor is more vigorously regulated than an abortion clinic? Does that seem right to you? Of course it doesn't seem right to people. People are horrified by these facts, but they don't know them. And I remember being pelted in the face with condoms by a set of Planned Parenthood protesters, because I'm an enemy of women after all. It was at a tailgate party in Iowa. And these women are pelting me with condoms, and why do you hate women? They're yelling. And finally I said to this woman, I said, let me ask you a question. How would you feel if pregnancy centers were taxpayer funded? Well, so wouldn't that strike you as fair? Why is it that Planned Parenthood, funded by taxpayers, is actually a political slush fund, giving millions and millions and millions of dollars every single election cycle to pro-abortion candidates? Does that strike you as fair? It doesn't strike anybody as fair, folks. My point is, even an issue as divisive as abortion, people actually can find common ground. And I'll tell you one other thing. I have taken the media into pregnancy centers. And with a young woman's permission, I have brought the media in as a woman was getting her sonogram or her ultrasound, and I've watched what that experience does, even to the most hard-bitten journalists, as they listen to a young woman tell her story about the bad guy she fell in with, and her assumption that she would get an abortion until she came to find that there were choices she had. And then they see the image on the screen. And believe me, most people will conclude, we got to change something here. I also talk to young people a lot about technology, because you see, technology, if we talk to young people about the reality of the technology that they depend upon, they will see, they do see, that actually they agree with us. I'll say to young people all the time, how do you like it in that device of yours? How does that world work for you? You know how that world works? It works for you. You are absolutely in charge of that technology world in the palm of your hand. You can control it. You can communicate with anyone. You can do anything, communicate with anyone, get anything you want on that device. You are in charge. It is personalized, customized, and you have incredible power over what you do, when you do it, and who you do it with. And just when you thought it couldn't get any cooler and any better, it gets cooler, and it gets better. And oh, by the way, it gets cheaper. That world is brought to you by the most intensely competitive global industry in the world. It is brought to you by the least regulated industry in the world. That is an industry that is incredibly intensely competitive, and yet Americans win because we're the most innovative nation in the world. And all that innovation and all that cool and all those price savings, they come because it is as close to a free market as we have left in the world today. Now, I might say to a young person, how'd you feel on your last trip to the Department of Motor Vehicles? How'd you feel? Because they've all, maybe gotten their license recently. How did you feel? Did you feel valued? Did you feel in charge? Did you feel in control? Would anybody even look you in the eye? Did any of it make sense to you? And did you have any control over what happened to you? Folks, that's a bureaucracy. And Democrats and progressives want more of that and less of the world that you have in the palm of your hand. Now, why do you think you're a liberal? The point is, as citizens, we can engage with people, start with where they are in their lives, and talk about in practical terms what our principles and policies mean in their lives versus what Democrats and progressives are selling. And here's one more. Student debt's a big issue, right? And Hillary Clinton's promising free college, brought to you by Bernie Sanders. You know how socialism starts? It always starts the same way. Government creates a problem, and then government steps in to solve the problem. Buried in the pages of Obamacare, which the vast majority of Americans do not know, and young people in particular do not know. Buried in the pages of Obamacare is the federal government takeover of the student loan business. It is why we actually should have read the bill before it was passed, and why Nancy Pelosi famously said, we got to pass it before we know what's in it. Well, what was in it was the federal government take over the student loan business. So what young people don't know is that the federal government is charging them about 4 times the rate for a student loan that the government pays on its own debt. In other words, folks, let that sink in. The government is making money off of every student loan. This is not the nation we were intended to be. George Washington, the father of our country, George Washington warned us in his farewell address to the nation, which took place in September. George Washington warned us about the rise of political parties. And he warned us in this way. He said the problem is political parties may become so focused on winning that they forget about governing. As citizens, we need to remember that. Of course we want to win. We want our team to win. And our team is better than their team. But in the process of trying to win elections, we cannot forget who we are, and we cannot forget our role as citizens. Ours was intended to be a citizen government of, by, and for the people. And so what ails us won't get fixed in a single election by a single candidate. It won't be the end in November. We, as citizens, have enormous power if we will use it. The power to persuade, the power to engage, the power to hold accountable, the power to raise a ruckus. And we ought to be doing all of that. I said it's important to remember who we are. So literally every day, I think about two of the most powerful symbols of who this nation is, because I think they tell us everything we need to know about the nation we can be and must be. I think about Lady Liberty and Lady Justice. Lady Liberty stands tall and strong, which is the way America must always be. She is clear-eyed and resolute. She doesn't shield her eyes from the evils of the world. She is prepared to look evil in the eye and call it by its name. And she faces out into the world. And that is the way America must always face, because we are an exceptional nation. And if a nation is exceptional, a nation must lead. And she holds her torch high, because she knows she remains, despite all our faults and troubles, she remains, we remain, a beacon of hope in a very troubled and tragic world. And when we are not strong, and when we do not lead, and when we do not hold our torch high, the world is an even more troubled and more tragic place. Lady Justice holds a sword, because she's a warrior. She's a fighter for the values and the principles that have made this nation great and the changes that must be made to keep this nation great. And we must be fighters as well. She holds a scale in her other hand. And with that scale, she reminds us that all of us are equal in the eyes of God. And so all of us must be equal in the eyes of the law and government, powerful and powerless alike. And she wears a blindfold. And with that blindfold, she reminds us, I think, that here in this nation, in this century, as our legacy, it must be true that it doesn't matter what you look like, and it doesn't matter how you start, and it doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter your circumstances. Here in this nation, every American's life must be filled with the possibilities that come from their God-given gifts. And we must be one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Abraham Lincoln stood on a blood-soaked battlefield. He had fought a war over, you will remember, matters of principle and the character of a nation. It took enormous courage to fight a war so bloody, but also to fight a war that was not in the economic self-interest of the United States for quite some time. He fought a war over the principle that these United States must remain united. He fought a war over the character of our nation because he believed that a nation that was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, that each of us have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that right comes from God, should not be taken away by man. He believed the character of such a nation could not be stained by slavery. And so he fought a war over values and principles. I am not suggesting we go to war. I am suggesting we do have a long battle in front of us. And as he stood on that blood-soaked battlefield in Gettysburg, he begged his fellow countrymen and women to fight so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of this great nation, this is our fight to ensure that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. God bless you all.